first impressions of Nolan and Tenet. So let's get to it. Is it a good film? I would say it's good, but it's on the lower tier of Christopher Nolan films. I'm going to give it a 7 out of 10, but it's going to be a weak 7 out of 10. I'd still recommend seeing it, but I'd have to be honest, if it wasn't Christopher Nolan, I would probably give this a score of 6 out of 10. It's a good movie by a good director, but it's not a very gripping movie. So without getting into spoilers, what is it? Well, it's essentially a kind of spy thriller and time travel movie, but Nolan is trying to be much more scientific. He's trying to be much more unique and creative, and I can appreciate that. But I have to be honest, the story and the characters for the most part were very boring, very lethargic. I wasn't very invested in what occurred. I think at times they kind of broke their own rules, so even in that respect, it wasn't consistent. He kind of made his point very, very early on in terms of the grandfather paradox, and he just kept going back to it. There are a couple of good scenes in terms of action, but a lot of the action is very, ho-hum. I mean, if you've seen the trailer, you've seen essentially what he's going to do. He's going to move time forwards and backwards. I thought the editing at times was a little too choppy. It didn't feel right. It felt like people were moving too fast or too slow. At times, the lighting wasn't very well done, and neither was the sound. I found the sound at certain points very frustrating. It didn't make a lot of sense. It didn't synchronize or didn't sound right. And the main characters were, for the most part, boring. I'd say Robert is actually an exception here. I actually found that Robert was actually pretty good, and even though he's actually also a very boring character, that was intentional. He's sort of supposed to be kind of like this side character. So I thought he was fine. But for the most part, the main characters are very boring, both the protagonist and the villain. I just didn't care. I was really puzzled who the main villain was for a while, and then I found it was Kenneth Branagh. And I'd like to say he disappeared into the role, but really I just really didn't register. He just is very plain, one note. Oh, he's a Russian villain, and that's about it. He just wants to destroy the world. Why? It's not really explained. He just wants to destroy stuff. So it wasn't very engaging in terms of the main characters. And I have to say Washington was pretty disappointing. I understood what he was picked for, but he just didn't come across as very charismatic or engaging. It was just very, very boring and dull. And there was one good scene with Michael Caine, which Washington is in. And that was a very, very well done, very well written scene. So I'm not saying Nolan can't write. I think when he's focused, he can write pretty well. But here it just felt very lazy. He just wants to give people his vision. Everything's being constructed around the script that he wrote, and that's it. But the characters don't really make a lot of sense. They don't have much complexity or inner life. And I didn't really care what happened, if the world was going to live or die, or, what was involved, or even the meaning of Tenet, because Tenet is given multiple meanings, and at the very end you can kind of decide for yourself what Tenet means to you, but I just didn't find it engaging in that way at all. And it sounds like I'm being very negative towards Nolan, but this is the only film besides Dark Knight I've seen in theaters of his, and that one I thought was excellent. It was a 4-star film. It inspired me to become a filmmaker. I still look back on it. I haven't seen it all the way through, so maybe, I'll be disillusioned if I see it again, but and that had a lot of problems too in terms of editing, in terms of the pace, and also where the plot went, where the plot just went into this really weird, stupid space. But even with the final third being a little wonky, I still think it's an excellent film. This kind of feels like the bad parts of The Dark Knight, but with no correction, no balance. It just keeps going and going. It's not as terrible as The Dark Knight Rises, but again, I'd say this is on the lower tier of Christopher Nolan films. Even with Interstellar and Inception, which are also very intellectual films, I still felt he was trying to communicate with other people. It wasn't just about him and his auteur vision. There was something else going on. But this feels a movie very much like it's just an auteur vision, and that's it. If you like it, you'll go with it. If you don't, and I did not, I found it very just a chore to work through it. And that's not how you should feel when you watch something in the theater. You shouldn't feel like a chore. So I paid about $15 to $16 for it. I'd have to say that's a little excessive. I don't regret seeing it, but if you have safety concerns or your budget is a certain way, then I would say wait for it on DVD or rent it. But if you can afford it and it's safe, then yes, I'd go see it. It does have a couple of great scenes, especially towards the end. There's a lot of Michael Bay kind of inspired scenes. They don't make any sense, but I thought they were fine. There's also some, again, good little moments with Michael Caine and others, but again, at the end of the day, it's more bad than good. So I have to just say my first impression of Tenet is kind of a very weak Christopher Nolan film. All right, that's it for Tenet in a non-spoiler review. I will be doing a much more systemic review, and of course the Kubrick connection, because there's a lot of Kubrick here too, but I just don't think it's the good kind of Kubrick. All right, thanks for listening.